I told her she didn't need to introduce me because I thought everybody here, except maybe for a couple of people, knew who I was, already knew too much. I'm going to do three things tonight, I hope. First, I'm going to tell you why I happen to write a book about freedom of association. Then I'm going to explain how the book is organized and how I hope it will convey what I want to convey. And then third, I'm going to identify 2 or 3 or 4 things that particularly interested me in the book. I would hope if they interested me, they might interest other readers. No guarantee on that, but I can assure you it takes some particular things to keep me interested in the topic and to keep writing and to keep doing research. So wait for those. That may be the best part. Okay, why did I write on freedom of association? I'm not a lawyer, have no legal background, have not written on any legal topics, although my 3 previous books each had a significant part of it dealing with a trial of some kind. A manslaughter trial in the case of John Daniels in Alabama, the court case, the lawsuit to get Meredith in here, and then the lawsuit to get Mississippi Conflict and Change adopted. So I knew a little bit about how to work with legal documents, how to work my way through a case file and things like that. But the real impetus for this comes from a dinner in 2011 that Brenda and I had with Jeff Stone. A mutual friend had arranged for us to have dinner in Baltimore at the Southern Historical Collection. And Jeff, he has a blurb on the book, is a longtime law professor at the University of Chicago. He's been dean of the law school, provost of the university, a recognized authority on constitutional law, and particularly an expert on the First Amendment. If he sounds impressive, he is, although he's not intimidating. I think we found him really easy to talk to and get to know and become friends with. Anyway, part of the way through dinner, Jeff wanted to know what I was doing. He knew I'd published the book on Meredith and the integration of the university. What are you going to do next? And I told him I was working on the book on the textbook, Lowen and Salas's Mississippi Conflict and Change. And I sort of said, you know, well, are you interested? What? And he basically then said, directly, you need to write a book about NAACP versus Alabama. And I thought, well, if this guy's telling me I need to do this, he probably knows more than I do. And so we talked about it a little bit. And I had to wait because I was already working on something else. I then, in the next few years, as I was working on this other project, I started nosing around about NAACP versus Alabama. And I began to have doubts, you know, could I really do a book on a major constitutional law case? So I asked some friends who are themselves almost of Jeff Stone's level of accomplishment. And every one of them said, yes, you need to do this. You can do it. One good friend said, look, and these are high-powered law professors. He said, look, you're intelligent and you read carefully. You can figure it all out. There's no magic to the law. You know, you may have to figure out what some words mean in terms, but you can do it. So then I began to think, well, maybe I should. Then as I learned more, I learned what freedom of association was all about, and that began to intrigue me and interest me. What freedom of association establishes is the right for you and me or all of us together to form a group or an organization to advocate anything we want to advocate, any belief, any political position, and it denies the government the right to interfere in what we're doing. Now, notice this comes in the late 50s, early 60s. There were, I meant to check this, some of the rest of you who worked at the university. I think when I started to work here in 1983, you still had to list the organizations you belonged to and the ones that you contributed to. Well, that was clearly unconstitutional. But guess what? It didn't make a whole lot of difference here. And wouldn't have made any difference in Alabama either. But I got intrigued by that, the whole notion of freedom of association. And then I ran across the quotation from Martin Luther King. And he said the court decision in Mississippi, in Alabama and NAACP, so the court decision was a victory for not only the Negro, but for democracy, hence the title of the book. And I thought, well, if Martin Luther King says it's important and Jeff Stone says it's important, maybe I should do it. Okay, so that's the background. That's how I kind of got involved in this. I had to wait until the book on Mississippi Conflict and Change was published to really dig in. And fortunately, I'd finished most of the research by the time the pandemic started, so that spring I started writing, and this is the result. So that's the first thing. How did I get interested? Second, how is the book organized? Well, if you've read anything else I've read, particularly the last 3 books, you'll see a pattern. There's an introduction that sets out the people and the issues in the case. It's actually not the introduction, it's the first chapter, but it introduces everybody. And occurs in the summer of 1956, the first few months of the case. Then it stops, and I back up, and I do what I find is, in some ways, the most fun. I then create the context for the case by offering 4 different perspectives on the case. Now, I'm going to wander some, forgive me. If you read the book on James Meredith and the integration of the university, you know the same thing happens there. James Meredith is not mentioned until a third of the way through the book, maybe even almost halfway. And some people don't like that. I had one reader for that manuscript say, that whole first 180 pages should be 1 chapter. And he was dead wrong, and my editor didn't pay any attention to him, fortunately. But that's what I do here. The case really, after that first little 15 pages, does not appear for another 80 or 90 pages. Because what I do is explain where the case comes from. First, biographical perspective. John Patterson, the Attorney General of Alabama, he's the prime mover behind this case. He's the one who instigates it. So I want to know, where does he come from? And what I found out very quickly is that John Patterson came from his father. He is Attorney General because his father was running for Attorney General and his father was murdered. He was assassinated. And so that's the only way John Patterson got into politics, was chosen then to run instead of his father in 1954. Biographical. There's a lot more in that chapter than just that, but that's the key thing. The second perspective is organizational, and this is in some ways the most interesting for me, because it develops in a full way the history of the NAACP in Alabama from 1920s up to the start of the case in the 1950s. I don't know offhand of any other discussion of a state organization like that. For some reason that you can well imagine, I don't have to tell you probably, but I will if you want, historians just have not been attracted to the NAACP, because if you come after in the 70s, 80s, and since, writing about the Civil Rights Movement, the NAACP is really dull. They're old-fashioned. They're fuddy-duddies. They're conservatives, and the excitement is with SNCC and King and CORE and all that stuff. So setting out the history of the NAACP in Alabama was really, I think, pretty helpful for my story, but also just interesting for me to see how it developed. And here I must, again, wander just a bit. There is a dissertation written by a woman who taught all of her career at Alabama State in Montgomery. Dorothy Autry wrote a dissertation in 1985, I think, at Notre Dame, that does the history of the NAACP. I relied on that as a good starting point and then did a lot more different kinds of research. Her dissertation in 1985 should have been published. By now it's out of date, the research and everything, but it's really an impressive unpublished piece of work. So, biographical, organizational. The third is regional. What happens in Alabama with this lawsuit in 1956 is not unusual. It's part of a South-wide campaign to eliminate the NAACP. Every state, from Texas to Virginia to Florida, has multiple attacks on the NAACP just to drive it out of business because it's the most successful civil rights organization. So I have to explain how all those states work together without explicitly working together. They influence one another and push the same thing and give this whole effort to kill the NAACP real momentum. Now, this case, NAACP versus Alabama, becomes the case in that whole Southwide fight. Cases from Texas and Louisiana and Florida are delayed until the court deals with this case. So this really is the key one in this time period. And I need to remind you, too, that the NAACP is only one of the targets, and it's a mixture that nobody, it seems in the 1950s, keeps clear in their mind. They confuse the NAACP with the Brown decision and with the Supreme Court. So if you're against one of them, you're against all of them, and you can almost talk about them interchangeably if you're a white Southerner, that you hate them all. You don't have to clarify the differences among the three. They're all just kind of the trinity of evil, I suppose, for segregationists. The final context that I developed is in some ways, the most interesting of the context, and that is the political context in Alabama. Because John Patterson runs for election for Attorney General in '54. He then, by '56, is ready to run for governor. So everything he does in this case, you have to know that in the back of his mind, maybe even the front of his mind, was, how will this help me win the governorship? It's all politically motivated. The other person who I deal with in some detail is the judge in the case. He has to run in 1958 also. And so they're jockeying for political power at the same time they're trying to handle this case. So, with that background, the case starts in June 1, 1956, when John Patterson goes into local court in Montgomery and asks the judge to issue a temporary order banning the NAACP, banning it from the entire state. The judge, Walter Jones, does. This all happens within 30 minutes. It's a setup. Everybody knows what's going to happen. And Jones issues the order, and it's delivered in Birmingham within an hour to the head of the NAACP in the state. Well, what is the charge? Well, the charge is that the NAACP had failed to register as a foreign corporation in Alabama. If you're incorporated somewhere else and you do business in Alabama, you have to register. None of these organizations, as far as I can tell, none of them did. CORE, SNCC, they didn't register. And NAACP didn't register in other states either. But that's what the charge is, violating that law. So that seems simple enough, except the NAACP is not involved in that initial meeting in court in June 1. So it wants to appeal that decision by the judge back in his court, okay? The judge, though, really would prefer not to do it that way, and so clearly working with the Attorney General comes in before the scheduled hearing and says, we need a lot of evidence to prove they're operating in the state. And one of the things they wanted was membership rolls. And membership rolls are the key thing here. because if the NAACP reveals its members, the organization dies. If it doesn't reveal its members, it's going to stay out of business. There's not a way to win this argument. And because of they refuse to turn over the membership rolls and other documents, the judge holds them in contempt and fines them initially $10,000 and a few weeks later $100,000. That's $1 million in today's money. So the NAACP has to fight this order and the contempt charge in the courts. You can imagine it goes to the Supreme Court in Alabama. The Supreme Court in Alabama, first of all, delays for months and then says, well, you know, you didn't file the right legal papers to get us to consider this. You got to go back and do it again. So they do it again, and then the court says, nope, wrong, throws it out. After delays like this, the NAACP then goes to the Supreme Court. Goes to the Supreme Court 4 times. The Supreme Court in 1958, the major decision, announces the idea of freedom of association. That's when we get that right that a lot of people think we've had all along, but in fact we hadn't. What is really, I think for me and maybe for other readers, I hope, interesting about this is to watch how the judges deal with the issues in their private sessions and in their memos and drafts of the opinion. And there are lots of issues here, legal issues, that are, you know, you would think if you just look at them first off, I think there's one lawyer here, he would probably be more comfortable with it than the rest of us. I mean, there are 2 lawyers. The issues are really very simple. And what I want readers to understand is I'm writing this book for lawyers, but also for non-lawyers. So everything that seems complicated or intricate or confusing, I had to find out and explain to myself so that I can explain it to the reader. I don't assume any reader knows what an amicus brief is or what a writ of mandamus is. I may not be pronouncing these words correctly. They're not in my vocabulary, at least spoken vocabulary. So I have to explain all that. Even things like what a clerk is on the Supreme Court. Clerk. I assume we all know, well, I'm pretty sure many of you know people who clerked on the Supreme Court, whether you knew they did or not. I met one the other day at the coffee shop down here. He did introduce himself that way, but I had to find out. He lives here in town. Well, what does a clerk do? I mean, I had some examples of their work. What do they do? Where did clerks come from? Who was the first clerk? What's the history of these clerks? So you have to lay that out in order to understand what they're doing. Same thing with amicus briefs, a history of the amicus brief and what the court does with it. So I followed the case through these appearances in the Supreme Court until finally in 1964, June 1, John Harlan, the justice of the court, who is very proper, almost conservative in his demeanor as well as in some of his politics, he's had it. And the opinion that he writes to the court is really kind of scorching. He's frustrated, annoyed, and is not going to put up with the delays by Alabama anymore. So that's what happens. Sends it back to Alabama, and they have to allow the NAACP to register. Then there's in the last chapter I talk about briefly the resurgence of the NAACP in Alabama and also the effect this case has on other cases. It's wide-ranging. Okay, third thing I want to do is tell you some of the things that really interested me. A couple of these I wish I could have done more on. The first one is Judge Walter Jones. He's the circuit court judge in Montgomery. He was the son of a governor, first elected as judge in 1920. He's an old hand by 1956. He also writes a newspaper column every week in the Montgomery Advertiser. I see him as kind of the prototypical white segregationist. You say, well, what? Two of his essays, columns. One of them was, I speak for the white race. That's pretty blunt, it seems to me. Another of his essays, not in the paper, but in a journal that he edited, was called, Is It Unchristian to Believe in Segregation? Well, that's a rhetorical question. His answer was clearly no. So developing his ideas, I think is almost a unique part of this book, because he wrote so much, and he was a smart guy, a literate person, very prominent in the community. I think I say in the book he's kind of a public intellectual in Montgomery. And so he puts forth his views on everything from the Civil War, Robert E. Lee, all the topics in Southern history, except slavery. He never writes about slavery. And that then lets him speak for and represent white segregationists. I find him a fascinating person. I haven't told you the key stuff about him. That's buried in a later chapter. You will have to read that for yourself and go, holy smokes. I had one reader from my manuscript say, he needs to put all this stuff about Walter Jones in one place. And I'm thinking, no, we're going to save this other stuff for later, because I want people to be surprised. I don't want them to be judging him by what I discover later. So, Walter Jones. Second person is a man in Mobile named John LaFleur. Arthur Shores, I could have said him too. He was very impressive. But John LaFleur is the leader in the Mobile branch of the NAACP from the 20s to the 50s. Just an astounding man. No more than a grade school education, career with the post office. He had a good job and ran the NAACP branch there like no other branch that in Atlanta, in Alabama at least. Just a impressive guy. Very good picture of him in the book too. This is what I have to share with you, because I taught freshman writing for a long time. I've tried to teach students how to write. This is John LaFleur writing to Roy Wilkins in 1936. This is in a footnote. Got to read the footnotes. LaFleur's writing was almost flawless, and his typing was nearly error-free. This is the day of manual typewriters. You didn't see any typovers. They were just, I don't know how he did it. In a remarkable typed letter to Roy Wilkins, LaFleur apologized for his rare error in an earlier press release. This is what he says. Observe that through typographical error, used pronoun who instead of objective case pronoun whom in last paragraph of report in referring to paradoxical position of Southern whites on the race question. Please accept this correction and apology. Am compelled to do so many things hurriedly that often make unnecessary mistakes. Boy, does that sum up his personality. Just wow. I was charmed by that, to say the least. So that's two people. Third person is Robert Carter, and this is going on longer than I expected. Robert Carter, he is the NAACP lawyer who argues the case. He is a colleague of someone you've all heard of, Thurgood Marshall. He's a colleague, he becomes a rival, maybe even an antagonist for Marshall. They don't get along. They're entirely different personalities. If you ask most historians of the Civil Rights Movement, they like Thurgood Marshall. I've got a friend who reveres him. Thurgood Marshall, I think, no, I don't like him. Robert Carter is the one. He's brilliant lawyer. and I'm trying to revive interest in Carter. He's been neglected, I think, by historians. I will say, however, his memoir that he wrote, I don't know, I guess in 2005 or something, is bitter, it's nasty, it's self-inflated. You kind of have to understand that what he's doing is trying to get people to recognize he's the one who deserves a lot of the credit that Thurgood Marshall received. And I think it's clear he did, but Thurgood Marshall is this huge personality that people just are drawn to. So, Robert Carter, pay attention to him. The fourth person, group of people, the justices of the court. I really enjoyed getting to know John Harlan, Felix Frankfurter, I am amazed by, and Tom Clark, a justice that most people don't pay any attention to. He's belittled on many occasions. He plays a key role in this case, so you need to look out for him. So, personalities captured me and I think helped propel the book along. I'll mention one other thing that I was attracted to and really kind of, I guess, proud of being able to put it together. An amicus brief is a brief filed by a friend of the court. It can be a friend of the either side or just someone interested in the issues who wants to give advice to the Supreme Court. Well, the amicus brief filed by the American Jewish Congress plays an amazing role in the decision. Very quickly, it asks the court if it can file a brief. And the court basically has to decide, well, what are the two parties in the case? If they don't approve it, we probably aren't. Well, Mississippi didn't approve. I mean, Alabama didn't approve it. It's easy to get Alabama and Mississippi confused. Alabama did not approve it, so they could not file it. But guess what? When you make your request to the court, you also include a copy of your brief. So the brief is at the court. It can't be officially recognized. Now, no one knows. We can assume that some of the clerks, maybe even some of the justices, saw that brief, whether it was officially in front of them or not. Well, that brief has a profound effect on the NAACP's case. It files the NAACP files a late brief in December 1957, before the major decision in 58. And the last section of its brief is lifted verbatim from the American Jewish Congress's brief. And you say, well, does it have an effect? We don't know. I assume it does. What I do know is that one of the authors of that brief publishes an article in the Columbia Law Review that spring that makes the very same arguments. And that journal would have been read by many of the people on the court. In fact, Felix Frankfurter writes to John Harlan and says, you're writing the opinion, be sure you look at this article. Don't quote it, and don't say I told you to look at it, but look at it. So it clearly has an impact. So what are we to make of all this? Well, I'm going to read you 3 quotes from the book, other people's statements, not mine. One lawyer who was aware of the case at the time later said, NAACP versus Alabama was a perversion of the legal system into an instrument of repression. It took 8 years because of all the traps and delays Alabama engaged in. Political scientist said what the NAACP faces here is an attempt to incapacitate or paralyze it by the state. And he says state court judges systematically and continually abuse their discretion to thwart civil rights. That's what it's about. The things that Alabama did to delay at all costs. We'll read you one paragraph from the introduction. This will be the last thing I'll say. This, I think, teaches us some lessons about the case. The unfolding story of NAACP versus Alabama, therefore, reveals the awkward development of an important new constitutional right. It's not smooth. It's really, in some ways, unpredictable, the development of the right. While it also demonstrates the power but ultimate futility of white massive resistance to the civil rights movement and the intrepid, implacable efforts of the NAACP in defending the rights of black citizens. So that's what it's about. I had fun doing it. Maybe you'll have fun reading it. I hope so. I'm done.
Did anybody have any questions?
Want to get home for dinner.
I guess if nobody has any questions, then I will just say thank you again to Charles. And if you wanted to buy a book and get it signed, we will be signing it.